Darkcast Network, bringing our indie podcasts out of the shadows. In part 1, we told of the brutal murder of 16-year-old Michael Brown and the ensuing hunt for his killer, 23-year-old Alexander Edmonstone, ending with Edinburgh police rushing to meet the train from Perth that Alexander was suspected of being on, only to find that no one matching his description alighted from the train. In part 2, we'll continue the hunt for Alexander and find out if he ever was brought to justice for murdering Michael Brown. Before we begin the second part of the Michael Brown murder case, I'm going to play you a promo for a case I recently listened to on the podcast Fuck That about Chad Hauer, the TikTok fugitive, where Ashley, over 3 episodes, tells us just how Chad has become a fugitive. I was shocked by what I heard and of what Chad has been through and is still going through, so I wanted to share his story with you.
Hello. I'm Ashley from Fuck That, a true crime podcast, and I want to share with you the details of a case I've recently covered. Chad Zachary Hauer was a prominent Microsoft employee living overseas, and he seemingly had a promising future ahead of him. He had full custody of his son Alex, whom he had during a previous marriage with his ex-wife Nancy Oberlander. He was remarried, planning on extending his family, and for all intents and purposes, Chad was on top of the world, but his ex-wife Nancy did not intend to let him off that easily. Nancy fled Tennessee, the state that had jurisdiction over their son Alex's custodial arrangement, moving to Pennsylvania without notifying the courts or Chad. This was the first of many deliberate moves Nancy made to prevent Chad from his inherent right to see his son. Once Chad was granted custody in 2005 and Alex was removed from Nancy's home by Venango County sheriffs in Pennsylvania, he felt relieved at the thought of his son finally being able to establish roots. But Chad's troubles were just beginning. Pennsylvania, a state where Alex lived for only a few months, in violation of Tennessee's custodial agreement, took emergency jurisdiction over the case, creating a domino effect that would forever change not only Alex's life, but Chad's life forever. Join me as I delve into the custodial battle that ultimately led to Chad Hauer becoming the TikTok fugitive, wanted by the FBI for international kidnapping, ultimately leading to an Interpol red notice. This case delves into the corruption at not only the state level, but the federal level as well, uncovering lies and corruption from the FBI, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and United States Assistant Attorneys, all while Chad fights for his independence and his life overseas. You can listen to Chad Hauer, the TikTok Fugitive, parts 1 through 3, wherever you listen to podcasts.
When all of the passengers had got off the train in Edinburgh and there being no sign of Alexander, following a conversation between the Edinburgh and East Weems officers, it was assumed that Alexander had got off the train a few stops outside of Edinburgh, but was still likely making his way to the city, with police believing that he would want to try and pawn the watch and chain he had stolen from Michael, as well as exchange some of the gold sovereigns he had for money. And so Edinburgh officers were given the task of visiting any pawn shops or sales rooms in the city of Edinburgh to see if such items had recently been pawned by anyone matching Alexander's description. And as luck would have it, in a pawn shop in the Canongate, which is about an 11-minute walk from Edinburgh city centre and Waverley train station, the police discovered a metal watch which matched the description of Michael's watch. And when the shop owner was asked to give a description of the man who had brought the watch in, it bore a resemblance to the description being circulated of Alexander. And so the police immediately had this watch sent to East Weems in order for Michael's family to confirm that they had indeed found Michael's watch, while also beginning a search in Edinburgh to find this man. It was just over an hour later when they received word from East Weems that the watch that had been found in the pawn shop in Edinburgh was not the one that had belonged to Michael. Also, the thorough search in Edinburgh of lodging houses and public parks, as well as all of the reports the Edinburgh police had received being investigated, turned up nothing else, which left everybody wondering, where was Alexander Edmonstone? With Edinburgh now having been thoroughly searched and no positive sightings of Alexander having been found, officers then began to wonder if perhaps Alexander had decided to make his way to Glasgow, which is on the west coast of Scotland, from Edinburgh on the east coast of Scotland. And so just to cover all angles, on Saturday evening, Constable Smith from East Weems was sent to Glasgow, along with a few civilians, who all knew Alexander and what he looked like, to work with police officers in Glasgow to see if they could track Alexander down. This would prove a very good theory, as later on Saturday evening, East Weems police received a phone call from a miner who had been working all day and upon returning home had seen the article in the newspaper about Michael Brown's murder and the description of the wanted man, who he just so happened to have travelled with by train on the Saturday morning. Although the clothing described was completely different to that of what was in the newspaper, which was of course because by that time Alexander had bought new clothing in Strathmiglo. The man said that he had briefly spoken to this man on the train and he told him that he was heading to Glasgow. He went on to say that he was struck by his appearance, saying that he was not all there, and observed him counting his gold coins that he took from his vest pocket. So the thought that Alexander had left the train before the Edinburgh stop was correct, and the theory that he might be in Glasgow was also correct. While Edinburgh officers were waiting to arrest Alexander off the train in Edinburgh, he was already making his way to Glasgow, with it being assumed that he had gotten off the Edinburgh-bound train at Kinross, about 55 minutes outside of Edinburgh, and made the 1 hour and 40-minute journey southwest to Glasgow. Upon getting there, he alighted from the train unnoticed and unchallenged, before leaving the train station and disappearing into the throng. Despite Constable Smith, a few locals from East Weems and Glasgow police officers spending the weekend making inquiries and searching for Alexander at lodging houses, hotels, the harbour and ports, after receiving a report that a man matching Alexander's description was said to have been making inquiries at a shipping office regarding Canadian sailings, and investigating the countless possible sightings of Alexander, this all proved fruitless, as no trace of Alexander was found. While some still believed that Alexander was in Edinburgh and others were equally assured that he was in Glasgow, it wouldn't be long until it was known exactly where Alexander had been, when on Monday the 22nd of February, 2 days after Alexander had been spotted on a train saying he was going to Glasgow, an important clue was discovered. Now, while Alexander has been hunted from one side of the country to the other, back in East Weems things are anything but quiet. Firstly, Dr. Watson and Dr. Currer conducted the post-mortem on Michael on Saturday, where, according to the Leaving Advertiser and Weems Gazette, on the 24th of February 1909, there were at least 6 wounds to Michael's face and head, one of which had fractured his skull, and that the wounds inflicted could either have been caused, according to the Fife Advertiser, on the 27th of February 1909, by a boot with an iron toe, or by Michael's head being smashed against the hard concrete floor of the lavatory. There was also a mark found on Michael's windpipe, but it could not be determined if this had been caused by an attempt to strangle Michael. According to the Courier, on the 9th of June 1909, Drs. Watson and Currer came to the conclusion that the cause of death was loss of blood and shock, probably aggravated by attempts at strangulation. Now on Saturday the 20th of February, while police officers were trying desperately to hunt down Alexander Edmonstone, and while the rather sombre post-mortem was taking place, as each hour passed, more and more people from the neighbouring towns and villages continued to pour into East Weems to visit the place and lavatory where the murder of Michael Brown had taken place, with it apparently being marvelled at by many at the boldness of Alexander to have carried out this horrific crime in such a public place. The Weems and District Tramway Company had all of their tram cars in operation throughout the weekend, even the trams that were only used for special occasions, But despite running full all day on both Saturday and Sunday, they could not cope with the influx of people that descended on East Weems, and hundreds had to walk to and from East Weems, with it being believed, according to the Leaving Advertiser and Weems Gazette, that about 3 p.m. on Sunday there were as many as 5,000 people, young and old, in the small village, crammed into School Wynd and along the main street overlooking the shore. But what of Michael's family, who were trying to come to terms with the fact that Michael had been taken from them so brutally? Well, on Friday night, Michael's dad, William, had spoken to a reporter from the Leaving Advertiser and Weems Gazette and said, "I can't realise that my laddie's awa. It is not like he had been ill for a time and we were waiting for the worst. He was such a quiet boy and liked his home, for he seldom went out at nicht." When William was asked how many of a family he had, he replied, "I'd 6, knew of only 5. He continued by saying that Michael's mother was so heartbroken she had taken to her bed. On Sunday, thoughts of Mrs. Brown continued, as many villagers, including Michael's close friends, were desperately sad about what had happened and remembered Michael by telling stories about him. Mrs. Brown herself was in such an extreme state of collapse that she could not bear to hear the noise of the church bells ringing for 15 minutes in the forenoon and afternoon on Sunday, and so a note was sent to the church and the decision was made to only ring the bells for 7 minutes on that Sunday. While people continued to arrive in East Weems throughout Sunday, the villagers attended the regular church service, where the precocious, without being cheeky, wee Mickey was remembered in a special reference by the Reverend George Lowe, where, according to the Fife Advertiser, he said, "No one ever saw anything but cheerfulness and happiness upon his face. He had a gentle, guileless spirit. He was diligent in business, kind and dutiful in his home, a good son and a good brother. Bearing with him amid the many temptations which beset the young in this place, the united, heartfelt sympathy of our community goes forth to the stricken home, and not only of our community, but of the whole country. We commend his parents, sisters, and brothers to the care and compassion of him who is kinder and wiser than we are, and restores our soul." And many were moved to tears by these words. However moving this service had been, worse was yet to come, as Michael's funeral was to take place the next day, on Monday the 22nd of February. However, as Michael's funeral was taking place, a phone call from a landlady in Glasgow to the police set the police back on the trail of Alexander Edmonstone. Michael's funeral took place on Monday. Businesses were suspended for the day, and curtains on all windows and blinds on all shops were shut as a mark of respect. While the funeral was due to begin at 3:30 p.m, for hours before this, a steady stream of men, women and children made their way to East Weems, and after many besieged the lavatory to glimpse the bloodied scene where Michael had lost his life, they then gathered at various vantage points from Michael's home all the way along to the cemetery gates, 800 yards away, as well as in and around the cemetery where Michael's small white coffin and male family members, being that of his dad, his brother, brothers-in-law and uncles, as well as friends and villagers, would soon pass. With it being said in the Fife Advertiser that the procession of 200 mourners that followed the hearse was the largest ever witnessed in the village. As was custom, the female members of the family did not attend the funeral and had already bidden Michael a goodbye. Following a moving ceremony, Michael's coffin with the inscription, "Nothing in my hands I bring, simply to thy cross I cling," Michael Brown, aged 16, was then lowered into its final resting place. It was estimated that more than 5,000 people had descended on East Weems for the funeral, with the tram cars yet again not being able to cope with the demand, and many having walked, cycled, or arrived by cart. So, like I said, as the funeral was taking place, police in Glasgow would receive their next lead in the hunt for Alexander Edmonstone when the owner of a boarding house in Renfrew Street in Glasgow called to explain that she believed the wanted man, Alexander Edmonstone, had been at her accommodation, and, after becoming suspicious and having entered his room, what she had found only further roused her suspicions. Apparently, on Saturday, the 20th of February, shortly after 11 a.m, she had received a phone call from a male asking if she had a vacant room for a couple of nights, to which she replied that she had and gave the price. Agreeing to pay up front, apparently telling the landlady that he had plenty of money, this man then turned up at the boarding house, paid his money, and was shown to his room. However, within 20 minutes, he left his room, telling the landlady that he was in a hurry to meet someone off a train, but that he would be back shortly. However, he never returned. The landlady did become suspicious when the man never returned, and on Monday afternoon, upon reading the newspaper about the man wanted for murder possibly having been in Glasgow with a description similar to the man who had been at her property on Saturday, she decided to enter his room. Upon doing so, and finding a pair of braces, socks, a shirt, a jacket, a vest and trousers with patches at the seat and bloodstains at the foot and on both legs, she immediately called the police. The items of clothing were immediately taken and shown to Constable Smith, who was in Glasgow from Fife, helping in the search for Alexander, and he positively identified the clothing to be that of Alexander, with the two patches on the seat of the trousers making the items unmistakably Alexander's. Further bloodstains were also noticed to be on the inside lining of the clothing, which had possibly been used to remove blood from Alexander's fingers. So, with these new pieces of evidence being discovered, efforts to trace Alexander were ramped up. A signed warrant for the apprehension of Alexander on the charge of murdering Michael Swinton Brown was finally issued on Monday, along with information notices being issued to police offices all over the country, which contained a photograph of Alexander and information about him being at Renfrew Street in Glasgow on Saturday and what he had been wearing before and after changing his clothing. This information being circulated to police stations and newspapers led to a number of sightings being reported to the police in and around Glasgow, such as a sighting in a shop, a 12-minute public transport journey north from Renfrew Street, where a man had tried to exchange gold sovereigns for silver. Also a sighting on one of the Clyde Ferries, which was about a 36-minute public transport journey west from the last sighting at Renfrew Street. Another sighting at Cambuslang, a 25-minute public transport journey southeast from Renfrew Street, and another sighting in Lark Hall, a 51-minute public transport journey southeast from Renfrew Street, where a man matching the description in every detail purchased a brown cap. By the time the police were able to investigate these sightings, having many others to investigate as well, the man thought to have been Alexander had disappeared. However, when a sergeant was trying to track down the man suspected to have been Alexander following being sighted at Lark Hall, word was then received that the same man may have since travelled to Hamilton, a 13-minute public transport journey northwest from Lark Hall. However, again, by the time the police got to Hamilton, the suspect had disappeared. On Wednesday, the 24th of February, the police received information that a signalman had seen a man leaving a shed on the Ardmore estate, a 1-hour, 49-minute journey northwest of Hamilton, the area where it was believed Alexander had last been. When officers went to speak to the signalman and produced a photograph of Alexander and his description, the signalman's son, who had also witnessed the man leaving the shed and had got a better look at him, exclaimed, according to the Fife Advertiser, "That's his very image." Sure now that this had been their man, all available officers were called in to help in hunting Alexander down, with gamekeepers and estate workers joining in the hunt. Everyone involved and in the area felt excited when word came that an arrest had been made in Govan, a 55-minute public transport journey northwest of Hamilton. However, the excitement soon died down when it was determined that the man who had been arrested was not Alexander. Hopes were raised again when a report came in of a suspicious man being seen in a library who resembled Alexander. However, again, when this was checked out, the man, despite appearing suspicious, was not Alexander Edmonstone. With it seeming that everyone wanted to be involved in the hunt for Alexander Edmonstone, about 6 p.m. on Wednesday, a man resembling the suspect was arrested by a constable in Maryhill, a 25-minute public transport journey northeast of Govan, where the last sighting had come from, and he was taken to a local police station. However, word had got out and crowds began to gather at the police station, with everyone being sure this time that Alexander Edmonstone had been captured. But again, it was quickly established that this arrested man was not Alexander. However, by this time, a large crowd of angry people had gathered at the small police station, and so the police officers inside had to call for help to disperse the angry mob. While police had no luck on Wednesday in finding Alexander, and the sightings by the signalman having turned up nothing, despite the many sightings and 2 wrong arrests being made, there wasn't time to be disappointed, as on Thursday there were more sightings reported that had to be investigated. This time, a sighting had been reported in Liverpool in England, a 3-hour, 43-minute journey south of the last confirmed sighting at Renfrew Street. Although despite detectives going to Liverpool to follow this up, again, this lead led nowhere, and so they headed back to Glasgow, as there had been another arrest back in Scotland that evening, following a sighting of a man similar to Alexander in Dumbarton, which is a 42-minute journey south of the last sighting by the signalman at Ardmore Estate. However, it was again proven that this man was not Alexander, and he too was released. By Friday, the 26th of February, a week after Michael had been murdered, it was now being stated that the sighting by the signalman on Wednesday of a man leaving a shed on the Ardmore Estate was not that of Alexander. But the police still did believe that Alexander had not left Glasgow, and so a continued vigilance was kept up in and around Glasgow, and a police presence was maintained at the Clyde Shipping Centre, as well as shipping centres in England, in Newcastle, Liverpool, and as far as London. A photograph of Alexander was also sent to every shipping centre and was placed on every liner that left the UK. However, despite the massive hunt for Alexander that had already taken place and the ongoing vigilance and investigation, no further sightings of Alexander were reported, and the trail well and truly went cold. On Saturday, the 6th of March, 15 days after Michael's murder and 14 days since the last confirmed sighting of Alexander, an award for £100, which in today's money would be about £9,600 or $12,000, was issued, along with 2 photographs of Alexander. But still, there were no further reported sightings of Alexander. He had simply vanished. That was until the 25th of March 1909, almost 5 weeks after Michael Brown's murder. On Friday, the 19th of March, John Atherton, a small dealer, arrived in Manchester in England, about a 3.5-hour journey southeast of Glasgow, and made his way to his lodgings in Burnswick Street, where he'd arranged to stay while he was in Manchester. Over the next few days, John Atherton met and chatted with the other lodgers staying at Burnswick Street, and Albert Edwards, and the landlady's son, Samuel Bridgewood. On Wednesday, the 24th of March, John Atherton attended the local police station to inquire about getting a peddler's licence, so he could work in Manchester, and while waiting for information, he happened to notice an award notice for £100 for the arrest of a man who was suspected to have committed a murder, along with a photograph, a description of the wanted man, and a description of a watch that he had stolen from his victim. As John looked closer at the photograph, he realised that the man in the picture looked very familiar. He was sure he had seen him before. In fact, he was sure the other lodger at Burnswick Street was this very man. He certainly looked very similar. However, not being 100% sure, he decided to say nothing, go back to the lodgings and try and find out if the other lodger was indeed the wanted man. And so, on Thursday the 25th of March, when John, the other lodger, Albert Edwards, the landlady, Mrs. Bridgewood, and her son Samuel were all having lunch together at the lodgings, John, while surreptitiously glancing at Albert beside him to try and decide if he was in fact the wanted man in the photo at the police station, asked Albert innocently if he happened to have a gunmetal watch. Not thinking anything of it, Albert immediately said yes and showed John the gunmetal watch he was wearing. The minute Albert left the lodgings to supposedly return to work, John immediately said, according to the Leaving Advertiser and Weems Gazette, "That's the man. I've been looking at him, and he's got his front teeth out, and has a gunmetal watch and chain according to the description." Mrs. Bridgewood phoned the police immediately and advised them that she believed the wanted Alexander Edmonstone was a lodger at her home. 3 detectives promptly arrived at the lodgings in Burnswick Street, and Mrs. Bridgewood gave them permission to search her lodger's room, where they found a portmanteau, or a Gladstone bag. Upon opening the portmanteau, detectives found clothing, a sandbag, which was suspected to have possibly been used to assault Michael Brown, cash, and the 3 cash bags that would have been carried by Michael Brown from the bank. The detectives then waited in the front room of the lodgings for Albert Edwards, now believed to be Alexander Edmonstone, to arrive home. Alexander Edmonstone, or Albert Edwards, had turned up at the lodgings in Burnswick Street in Manchester on the 1st of March, where he had been since he disappeared in Glasgow from the Renfrew Street lodgings after leaving his bloodied clothes there on Saturday the 20th of February until this time is a mystery. It is believed he chose the name Albert Edwards as it fitted with the initials A and E he had tattooed on his arm. When he arrived at the lodgings in Manchester, he told the landlady, Mrs. Bridgewood, that he had been staying at a temperance hotel, but that it had been too expensive. He told the landlady and her son that he had a job at the nearby motor show, but he was noted to not leave the lodgings until about 11 a.m, come back for his lunch at 2 p.m, before heading back out again half an hour later, returned for his tea at 5 p.m, then spent his evenings visiting places of amusement. And he didn't appear to know much about cars, despite his supposed job. It was later discovered that Alexander spent his days not working, but instead enjoying his time at the races. Over the next few weeks, Samuel Bridgewood and Albert Edwards became friendly and would regularly go out drinking on an evening together, with Samuel later saying that Albert would pay for the drinks and that he didn't appear to be short of money. As the 3 detectives and Mrs. Bridgewood are in the front room of the lodgings waiting for Albert Edwards to arrive home, shortly before 6 p.m, Mrs. Bridgewood decided she would go and make them all a cup of tea. However, she had quite the surprise when she entered the kitchen, as the man that had been waiting to arrive home, Albert Edwards, was standing in the kitchen. Before Alexander could escape again, though, the 3 detectives made their way quickly to the kitchen, and upon discovering that the man calling himself Albert Edwards was indeed the wanted man, Alexander Edmonstone, they placed him under arrest. Alexander made no objection, appearing quite calm, and when he was asked about the murder of Michael Brown, he apparently put out his hand to shake the detective's hands and said, "It's all right, I didn't know what I was doing." Before being led away, he shook the hand of Mrs. Bridgewood and said, "Don't trouble about me, Ma." He then was transported to the local police station. The following day, Friday the 26th of March, Alexander appeared at the Manchester court, where he was formally charged with Michael Brown's murder, and where he reiterated, "I did not know what I was doing. My head was blank." He was noted to have a flushed face and be nervous at this time, standing in the dock with his head down. He was then remanded in custody to await Fife police to arrive and escort him back to Scotland for trial. As Fife officers and Alexander Edmonstone made their way back to Scotland, word of his arrest and imminent arrival back in Scotland began to circulate. And so, on Saturday the 27th of March at about 9:25 a.m, after a train and car journey from Manchester, Alexander, sitting between 2 detectives in the back of a car, was whisked past the crowd that had gathered outside the County Court building in Cooper in Fife. He was seen to keep his eyes cast downwards and did not appear to react as the hostile crowd shouted at him as he was led into the County Court building, where he stood before Sheriff Armour while the full charge of murder and robbery was read out. When asked by the sheriff if he wished to make a statement, Alexander replied, "I have nothing to say." Alexander was then told he would be remanded in custody at Perth prison until his trial, before being handcuffed and led downstairs, where he apparently ate a good breakfast before being led out of the court building once again to the waiting car. However, this time his features had changed, and according to one of the now 250 to 300 people who waited outside to shout and boo at him, he appeared sulky, his step appeared to falter, and he was a pitiable object. While Michael's family and those close to Michael who had been affected by his brutal murder were so relieved that his murderer had been caught, many felt that due to the 5-week delay in him being captured, it now reopened the awful wound for the Brown family, with many feeling sympathy for Michael's family as strong as on the day of his murder. However, Michael's family would have to wait a bit longer, as the 2-day trial wasn't to begin until Tuesday the 8th of June in Perth, a further 2.5 months. And to further add to Michael's family's grief, Alexander had pleaded not guilty, and his solicitors had submitted a plea of insanity and that he was not responsible for his actions at the time of the murder. And what of Alexander's family? They too must have felt grief and despair for the situation their son found himself in. I wonder if it helped them to have apparently received a message from Alexander after his arrest, which read, "Cheer up, father and mother, don't worry about me." Now, while everyone was waiting for the trial to start, there was a bit of a debate going on about who should get the £100 reward. Should it be the lodger, John Atherton, who had realised that Albert Edwards was in fact Alexander Edmonstone, or should it be the landlady, Mrs. Bridgewood, who had actually reported the information to the police about her believing her lodger was Alexander Edmonstone? After some backwards and forwards and debates in the newspapers, it was eventually decided that the lodger, John Atherton, should get the reward, as it was actually him who saw the photo of Alexander at the police station and brought everyone's attention to the fact he was living quite openly in Manchester. On Monday the 7th of June, the streets of Perth were full of people celebrating the 39th anniversary of the 8 hours a day working limit for miners. Everywhere you looked, people were dancing to the music the bands were playing in the streets, were drinking, laughing, and generally being merry late into the evening, where the late trains would carry the partygoers away from the city, once again leaving the city of Perth quiet and peaceful. That was until 9 a.m. the following morning, when again the streets of Perth were full of people, but this time for a very different reason: to try and get a seat at the murder trial at the High Court, led by Lord Guthrie, or at least catch a glimpse of the accused, Alexander Edmonstone, arriving at Perth Circuit Court. However, they were in for disappointment, as Alexander Edmonstone had been transported from Perth Prison to the Circuit Court in Perth at a much earlier hour. At 10 a.m, the trumpets were sounded and the task of selecting a jury began. Upon a jury being selected, agreed on by both the defence and the prosecution, and taking a seat, Lord Guthrie then entered a now packed courtroom promptly at 10:30 a.m. And then finally, a trapdoor in front of the dock was raised and Alexander Edmonstone, accompanied by 3 policemen, ascended the steps and stood in the dock. According to the Leaving Advertiser and Weems Gazette on the 9th of June 1909, Alexander was clean-shaven with not the slightest trace of dejection on his face, with it also being noted that he'd put on some weight since his arrest. However, Alexander's apparent nonchalance appeared to waver on the diet being called, which just means that the jury were asked to take their seat, as apparently at this point Alexander jumped to his feet thinking his time had come to speak, before being told to sit back down. Upon the charge being read out again and Alexander pleading not guilty and his special defence of being insane at the time of the tragedy being put forward, the Crown began putting forward their case. A photographer and architect who had been asked to take photographs and prepare a plan of the lavatory where Michael had been murdered firstly took to the stand to set the scene for the jury. Then followed the senior partners at the linen manufacturers, where Michael was employed, who told of Michael's journey every Friday for the employees' wages and the route he would take. Michael's dad, William, also took to the stand. The clerk at the bank who had given Michael the wages money on the Friday he had been murdered also took to the stand, describing exactly what had taken place that day in the bank and how much money he had given Michael. Witnesses who had been in Buckhaven on the Friday Michael had been murdered also took to the stand to say they had either seen Alexander there that day or Michael or both, and basically placing Alexander in Buckhaven at the same time as Michael on the day he was murdered. 14-year-old Peter Adamson, who had been on the tram car with both Michael and Alexander on the day of the murder, also took to the stand, as he was able to place both Michael and Alexander as being on the tram car at the same time that Friday. Tramcar 1 conductor Mr. Chalmers also took to the stand, and he too was able to place Alexander and Michael in his tramcar before they both alighted at the top of School Wynd shortly before Michael was murdered. Witnesses who had seen either Michael, Alexander, or both making their way down School Wynd on the Friday after alighting from the tramcar also took to the stand, as did the man who had heard the gurgling sound and shuffling of feet coming from the lavatory shortly before Michael's body was found. The man who had found Michael's body also gave his testimony, as well as Constable Stewart, who had quickly been on the scene, who described exactly how he had found Michael. Constable Stewart had also been one of the officers who had escorted Alexander back from Manchester after his arrest, and when he was asked what Alexander's demeanour had been on the journey, he said he appeared to be depressed, as one would expect him to be when he was facing such a serious charge. Inspector Cameron also took to the stand and detailed the search in and around East Wemyss and the subsequent hunt that had taken place in trying to find Alexander. Dr. Watson, who had pronounced Michael dead at the scene of the murder and carried out the post-mortem, as well as Dr. Currer, who carried out the post-mortem with Dr. Watson, both took to the stand and told of their findings, with both confirming that the cause of death was the loss of blood and shock, probably aggravated by attempts at strangulation. Professor Littlejohn from Edinburgh also took to the stand to advise that he had been sent the clothing presumed to have been Alexander Edmonstone's that had been found at Renfrew Street lodgings in Glasgow, and that after tests he was able to determine that most of the blood found was human, although other tests had come back as inconclusive. Next on the stand were witnesses who had seen or spoken to Alexander while he made his way from East Wemyss after killing Michael to Perth, where he stayed the night at a temperance hotel, and they confirmed that the man in the dock was the man they had either seen or spoken to on Friday the 19th of February. The landlady at the lodgings at Renfrew Street in Glasgow, where Alexander had paid for a room before leaving 20 minutes later and not returning, also took to the stand and confirmed that the man in the dock was the same man who had paid for the room before vanishing. Detective Inspector Riding from Manchester, who had arrested Alexander, also took to the stand and spoke of how Alexander had come to their attention. Items such as the blood-stained clothing found in Glasgow, the remains of the money that had been stolen, the gunmetal watch that had been stolen from Michael, the portmanteau and sandbag thought to have been used to attack Michael were all entered as evidence. Day 1 of the trial was then drawn to a close, with the defence to begin presenting the following day. On the second day of the trial, Wednesday the 9th of June, the day Alexander Edmonstone would learn his fate, began and largely ended with his defence team putting doctors on the stand to try and get across the theory that Alexander was not responsible for his actions at the time of the murder. According to the Evening Telegraph and Post, Dr. Scott, a physician at the Sick Children's Hospital in Edinburgh, said that on the 25th of July 1908, Alexander, who was 22 at the time, had been admitted following a referral from a doctor in Buckhaven, following Alexander complaining of pain in his chest, head and neck, after he had been found lying on the sand near his home in a state of excitement. Dr. Scott said that on Alexander being admitted, he seemed to be in a state of great pain, and although he was conscious, he seemed to be dazed. On examination, Alexander was found to have a high temperature, be sensitive to bright lights, and was noted to be apathetic and dull and heavy in appearance. Following testing of his joints and muscles, they were found to be abnormal, and there was an eruption at his elbows, wrists and knees, and there was tenderness when his spine was pressed. Dr. Scott concluded by saying that Alexander's condition improved and he was discharged a week or so later. When he was asked by the defence if he felt that Alexander at the time had full perception of what had happened, Dr. Scott answered, "I do not think so." When he was asked if he had come to a conclusion as to the nature of Alexander's condition, Dr. Scott replied that it was difficult to make a diagnosis, but possibly a nervous disease. However, Alexander's patient notes from his time under Dr. Scott's care said it was believed that Alexander had in fact suffered from sunstroke. Dr. Scott was then asked if his opinion that Alexander was merely suffering from sunstroke would change if he knew that since Alexander had been admitted to hospital in July the previous year, he had had a further 3 similar attacks, and on one occasion he had been found lying in the street unconscious, to which Dr. Scott replied, yes, it would alter it. He was then asked again, now that he had this information, what he would have diagnosed Alexander with back in July, to which Dr. Scott replied, I should think it would make it more like a case of epilepsy than a case of sunstroke. On cross-examination, Dr. Scott was asked if Alexander had said or done anything when he was in hospital that would lead Dr. Scott to believe he was insane, to which Dr. Scott replied, no. At this time, Judge Lord Guthrie actually asked Dr. Scott, did he say or do anything to show that his mental capacity was different from an ordinary individual? To which Dr. Scott replied, no. Next onto the stand was Dr. Bruce, who, along with Dr. Clouston, had physically and mentally examined Alexander while he was at Perth prison, and said that Alexander was a well-developed man who had a high, narrow palate. And that was a very general rule in a person predisposed to a nervous disease. It was explained that the frontal lobe of the brain rested on that portion of the skull above the palate, and that if you had a highly arched palate, then this will naturally diminish the capacity of skull for containing the brain. Dr. Bruce went on to say that during the examination, a painful spot was found on the left side of Alexander's cranium, that his pupils were unequal, that his hands and facial muscles were tremulous, and his tendon reflexes exaggerated. Dr. Bruce and Dr. Clouston were then asked, in their opinions, based on their physical and mental examination, what had Alexander been suffering from when admitted to hospital the previous year, with Dr. Bruce stating that they believed Alexander had showed signs of a very serious brain disease, going on to say that from the examination they concluded that Alexander was a degenerate, who likely had epilepsy, and such a person would have less self-control and limited responsibility. The questions for Dr. Bruce continued for some time from the defence and Lord Guthrie, while the prosecution cross-examined him, until Dr. Bruce was asked, can you suggest anything in the commission of this crime which differentiates the actions of Alexander from those of a sane man? To which Dr. Bruce replied, no, I obtained no facts which would lead me to do so. I am very definite in the fact that he is not insane. And then, to conclude, Alexander's mum, dad and sister took to the stand, where the packed-out courtroom heard how Alexander had frequent illnesses where he had been discovered unconscious, at which times he would talk and act strangely. It was noted that until his mum took to the stand, he had been completely impassive and had stared defiantly ahead as each witness took to the stand. However, upon his mum getting upset on the stand, his head was noticed to drop and tears began to run down his cheeks, and he appeared not to recover from this point onwards. And finally, at 12:30 p.m. on Wednesday the 9th of June, the case for the defence was closed and the closing statements begun, which ended in the prosecution strongly appealing to the jury to return a verdict of guilty after the defence's frivolous and unsubstantial case, and the defence saying that the jury couldn't possibly find Alexander Edmonstone guilty of murder and send him to the gallows in the face of his diagnosis of epilepsy, but instead should return a guilty verdict for culpable homicide, which would spare him a death sentence. Lord Guthrie then instructed the jury and they retired to consider their verdict. Just 10 minutes later, everyone was back in the courtroom as the jury had returned with a unanimous verdict. And the verdict was one of guilty. Alexander Edmonstone was to be hanged on the 6th of July between the hours of 8 and 10 a.m., at which point Alexander collapsed. It was all too much. Alexander was then returned to his cell at Perth prison to await his hanging, where he was watched constantly over the following week, as his health had declined rapidly due to him not eating following his shock death sentence. Perhaps he had been confident he would have got off, and it was only now starting to sink in just what his fate was. While his mother and father visited him, it did nothing to bolster him, as they were both heartbroken and in tears at what was to become of their son. However, Alexander soon seemed to accept his fate, accept that he was going to die, and told his wardens that he was prepared for it. Despite a petition being started for a reprieve for Alexander himself refused to have anything to do with it, and was opposed to any steps being taken to obtain a reprieve, apparently saying, according to an article in the Montrose, Arbroath and Brecon Review on the 18th of June, that it would be a living death to have to spend the remainder of his life in prison. And so, after sleeping well and apparently partaking in a fair breakfast, Tuesday the 6th of July, execution day, came around, with no reprieve and no fanfare. He was quietly led to the gallows where, upon the white cap being placed over Alexander Edmonstone's head, he was heard to mutter, "May the Lord have mercy on my soul." Thank you again, Nikki Bray, for suggesting this case. Okay, here's another.
Dawn's Digest.
So in this Dawn's Digest, I'm going to tell you about a fantastic giveaway we have for you. But first, I'd love to give a shout out to Kirsty Martin, who sent us a wee email saying that she was really enjoying the podcast and was hooked. Thanks so much for messaging, Kirsty. We're so pleased you're enjoying the podcast. So we've mentioned a few times now that Scottish Murders will be attending CrimeCon in London on Saturday the 10th and Sunday the 11th of June 2023, and that we hope to see as many of our listeners there as possible. So for those that haven't bought their ticket yet, or if you'd like to get a ticket for a friend, we have 2 tickets covering both days to give away. All you have to do is find the post about this on our social media, like it, and comment why you'd like to attend CrimeCon by 12 noon BST on the 11th of May 2023. Everyone who does this will be entered into the draw, and the winner will be announced later that day. Good luck, everyone. You can find the full weekend schedule at crimecon.co.uk. And find us on Instagram at Scottish Murders Podcast, on Twitter at Scottish Murders, and facebook.com/Scottish Murders. That's MURDURS. So just a wee reminder that there's still time to vote for us for the Top Podcast Listener's Choice Award at truecrimeawards.co.uk, which we'd really appreciate. And just to let you know, for the next few months, we're going to be covering cases suggested by our listeners. So there will be no theme, as that is the theme. So I'm going to leave you today with a promo for our new podcast, Scottish Digest, with the first episode going to be released on the 22nd of May. Each week on Scottish Digest, we'll tell you about a different place to visit in Scotland. We'll also tell you what you can do and see while you're there. We'll give you personal recommendations of places to eat and stay, and we'll even tell you about events and festivals that will be taking place. So join us on each episode for a wee slice of bonny Scotland.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.